Our next speaker talking about climate change in Florida is Colin Polsky from the Florida Atlantic University. Is it burrowing owls or fighting owls? Owls? Okay. I give you Colin and the owls.
Does anybody remember Monty Python? And now for something completely different. I appreciate the invitation. This is a fascinating conference. My name is Colin Polsky. I'm a climate social scientist at FAU, where I also direct the new environment school. And I think in answer to the last question, it is the burrowing owls. We just don't say burrowing very much, but that's a nice distinction. So indeed, this will be something new and fresh for this conference, but also, judging by the title of the presentation, Climate Change and the Partisan Divide in Florida, I suspect you may think we'll be talking about something different than, in fact, we are. But it's something that's important to me. So I'm an academic, and I'm interested in observing and understanding the patterns that we see, in this case, in climate change responses in the form of policy or other behaviors by people. And then locally in Florida, as well as at the national level. And so one concept that's come to mind lately for me is this notion of a durable climate consensus. So what would a durable climate consensus look like, and how can we get there? So I hope to answer that question for you with this basic structure here, where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. So about 25 years ago, or 35 years ago rather, in the summer of 1988, this gentleman here testified before Congress and the Senate in the summer. And it was a hot summer, it was a big heat wave summer. And this is Dr. James Hansen from NASA. And he was leading some of the research group at NASA on climate change, which was a much less prominent topic than it is today. But he changed that, and his testimony said that global warming has begun. This is a clip from the photo and the text from the actual news story of the next day, in this case from the New York Times. And basically the bombshell headline from his testimony was, we, the scientists, are 99% sure that the warming we've seen is human-caused and that it will continue, if not accelerate, unless we address our carbon emissions. So that was 1988, and fast forward to 2016 or 2017 here, with President Trump, and as the headline shows there, he's speaking, I think, in April of 17, making good on one of his campaign promises to cancel the Paris climate deal. And so that was a global, international effort to reduce carbon emissions, and no such effort will ever be successful without the United States. The Obama administration signed on to this. We can talk more about that, but then Trump said, well, it's not for me. And in fact, he said, you may recall, climate change is a hoax. Global warming is a hoax. Interestingly, this image from Newsweek is not from 2017, not talking about President Trump, but it's from 2007. And so starting in 1988, as I showed with Dr. Hansen testifying in launching a national conversation, even a global conversation about climate change, and on the committee actually before which Dr. Hansen testified was a person named Al Gore, who soon published a book that got a lot of press, and another senator, I believe, named Joe Biden. So this issue has roots with those individuals starting there in 1988. But there's been this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about the level of seriousness or energy with which the national policy and international policy community and even state and local policy communities take this issue. In some cases, like with Trump, trying to actually reverse efforts to reduce carbon emissions. But it's premised often the debate on, well, is it real or is it not? And if it's not real, well, then the whole notion that it is real is a hoax, and you all are probably familiar with this, this back and forth and this debate. So there have been polls now periodically and regularly, including one that I run at Florida Atlantic University that we'll talk about shortly, where one of the central questions is, do you believe in climate change? So here is a result for the national level from May of this year. And you see on the right, I hope you can see that, 75% of Democrats nationwide, as of May, so this is current, this is present day, say they believe in climate change and it's largely caused by human activity. The Republican number is much lower at 25%, which means we're at about actually 49% nationwide across the parties. That's what I mean by a durable climate consensus, is we got to get, and so here, so I am an academic and I'm interested in just calling it like I see it. I do believe personally that reducing emissions is important. But it's not going to happen as long as we're at this 49-51 type razor-thin margin. And so there we are at 49%, and that helps explain some of this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Another of the important survey questions is, are you willing to pay a climate tax? You know, no one likes paying taxes, but for certain issues that people are concerned about and for which there's a public interest, and where it might be expensive, the question of tax is kind of necessary thing to talk about. And so people might say they believe in it and they're worried about it, but they might not be willing to pay a climate tax. So not much might get done. So nationwide, the current public sentiment is about 25% of Republicans say they support a climate tax, and about 48%, 45% of Democrats. There too is evidence of why we're at this razor-thin margin without a durable climate consensus, because if we're going to keep it real, we got to recognize that money, it will cost money. And if the party that is so strongly in support of climate change is not even half ready to pay a climate tax, then that explains some of the kind of ease with which we oscillate back and forth at the policy level, doing stuff and not doing stuff. What does it look like? Well, here are a couple photos from not too long ago. We have, you know, on the top left, there's a demonstration of what you might call the anti-climate community. They have signs there that say CO2 is not a pollutant, I heart CO2. And then if you see on the right poster, a clip from the scientific record on climate change, goes back about 1,000 years, that is just a portion of the story. But the point here is that you have the intersection between science and policy and public opinion, and it's a potent mix, and so I'm trying to unpack that. On the bottom right, you see a pro-climate march, a pro-even science march, and that's from Miami. The top photo is from Australia, incidentally, and I use that in part to make sure we realize or recall that this phenomenon is underway globally, and it looks similarly in the U.S., in some other places as it does in the U.S. But here we have, on the bottom right in Miami, a march with people and their children, and in science we trust, and scientists will save the earth. And so again, it's this intersection, this perhaps incidental or accidental marriage of science and policy that sometimes can become an obstruction, I will argue. Where we are today at the national level is with the current administration in Washington, again, a razor-thin margin. The Senate is barely held by one party, that's the same party in the White House, and the House of Representatives is in a free fall, of course, but it's not, and they don't have much of a majority there, the Republicans. So we're very much a split and razor-thin margin national government, but with that comes some pretty bold movements on both sides. And so President Biden got through legislation on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and where we have here illustrations of all the things that now are possible incentives to reduce our carbon emissions, electrify our transportation, solar panels on homes and buildings. And here just is a very brief graphic that is associated with this effort. National policy, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, it's the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Billions and billions of dollars are now available to local communities and states to reduce emissions. And so what you have here on the right, no need to go into the graph in great detail, but it's time on the x-axis on the bottom, 2005 to 2030, so it's looking into the future a little bit. And on the y-axis, up to down, is just a measure of our greenhouse gas emissions. The story of the line is it's going down, and going down rather quickly as a result of this legislation. And so that's evidence of what can happen when we have this razor-thin margin that is in control of the wheels of the gears of government. But again, it's a razor-thin margin, and so there's absolutely no reason to believe it's unlikely that as of next fall, the balance of power in Washington will shift back to the Republicans. And so what parties do, one of the things, and here's an illustration of that, is a book that they've recently published, some of the thought leaders in the Republican Party, 2025 Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. And they're laying out what we would do if we gain control again in Washington. And they go through all the issues, and that's what parties do, and you expect them to try and articulate their vision and be persuasive. When it comes to climate, environment, and energy, they're very clear. They will reverse all of the efforts that have recently been put into play. So again, that is something we should pay attention to, interested in climate change if you are, because whatever gains may have been realized in these 4 years may soon evaporate. But then they may soon take root again for 8 years after next year, just back and forth and back and forth. And that's the opposite of this notion that I'm putting forth of a durable climate consensus. If this issue becomes less at a 51-49 type razor-thin margin, then the issue will oscillate less. And I think that's the only way that we can make a meaningful progress. You can't just tackle this problem in 2 or 3 or 4 year increments and then backslide. So that's where we are and how we got here. Here's a photo from a recent visit that President Biden made to here. I don't know if it's to this town, but it's in the wake of Hurricane Idalia. And he's talking about the hurricane, and as presidents do after hurricanes, extending thoughts and prayers and offering assistance. The quote from the story that has a quote from the president, I will read. Mr. Biden seemed to weigh in last weekend during a visit to Florida after Hurricane Idalia. Quote, "Nobody intelligent can deny the impact of the climate crisis anymore," he said. When I read this, I said, Joe, of course I was talking to myself. If it had been to him, I would have said, Mr. President, this is not helpful. In fact, it's the opposite of helpful, because he's calling people who are not supportive of climate action of whatever kind unintelligent. And it may be tempting to do that, but it is, in the long run, especially for important issues that have razor-thin margins, not productive. That's my opinion. How we got here, though, does not begin with the president last month. This is a political cartoon that tracks some of these same interactions, not for the reason that I'm offering it to you, but at the top it says an age-old argument, and then in red from the top left to the right, it says 15th century, and here's my attempt to be an archaeologist, by the way. 15th century, and a person at the ground with a ruler. If the earth is round, then explain this. And so he's got a snarl on his face, and he's resisting the science. Because of course the earth is not round. Look, he's proving it. In the 17th century, there's a person angrily pointing to a flying bird above. If gravity is real, explain that. And of course, he's, again, resisting the science, the ridiculous notion that gravity exists in the face of flying birds. 19th century, if evolution is real, then explain this. And another man angrily pointing at something, in this case, the Bible. Ending with the 21st century, which is where, of course, we are. If global warming is real, then explain that. And an angrily snarling man pointing to a snowflake. And so I think, in general, we need to have a sense of humor. It's very helpful in trying times, especially. And teasing can be a part of that, teasing oneself. But there is a moment or a line at which teasing becomes condescension. And that is what has unfolded, as I am suggesting, with the president's remarks, but not only his. And it is problematic. In fact, what we have is a long tradition now, at least speaking now of the century, of science in the public sphere, kind of distancing itself. And so this accelerated after World War II, where the science apparatus was so instrumental in helping us win World War II that we gave birth to the National Science Foundation and became truly world leaders in science and technology for the public good. Well, along with that development has come a kind of cultural learned behavior among scientists to not get involved in debates, but just to present the facts. And so there's this notion that science is like in a church or in a temple, high on a hill, and does not have to deal with people and their opinions. And that can also lead to at least perceived condescension, and that has certainly happened in this case. So let me just fast forward here to this slide. Does anybody recognize this gentleman? Yes, so Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. In this interview, I have the video, the link there, you can click on it or I can email it to you. He's running for president. This is 2015 or 2016, and don't forget, Trump won, but at the end of the race were two other people standing who in the end were defeated, and he was one of them, and he's still young and ambitious, and but here he is talking about climate change and his views on climate change, and he's invoking the science. Kind of like that poster I pointed to in the Australian protest that you couldn't see very well, but it had, again, 1,000, 1,500 years of data on global temperatures that was cherry-picked and presented as though we have evidence for climate always changing, which is true, and that there's no reason for alarm. And here the senator says the same thing. In the last 17 years or so, he says, there's been no warming. And, that's true, but not the whole picture. So that's some cherry-picked data. The point here is that, again, the intersection between science and policy, so he's running for president, that's politics, but obviously also in charge of, or influential in policy, can be messy. And we, as in the academic community, are constantly needing to walk this fine line between engaging and sharing opinions, not just about what we should do policy-wise based on the science, but also opinions about anyone who disagrees. And that's problematic for where we are at this razor-thin margin. Again, looking for a durable climate consensus. So let's try and talk a little about what that might look like, where we're going. And being interested in Florida, let's have this conversation look more at Florida. Florida has not had much Democratic Party influence in policy in a fair bit of time. This is now my 10th year in Florida, and pretty much dominant Republican control in the state legislature and the governor's house. Yet, it may surprise you that the state has been investing rather heavily in climate resilience, is the key word, or the buzzword, climate resilience programs in recent years. So after Governor Scott left office, DeSantis came in, and there has been a massive investment in climate stuff, programs designed to help prepare Florida and Floridians for climate change. This is no small investment, and it's basically done, I think, entirely with zero input from Democrats, elected Democrats. That's a little unusual. So what we're doing at FAU is running a regular survey, a statewide public opinion on climate resilience. We've had, I think, 8 waves of data, and they're all on all the raw data, the spreadsheets are on our website, and the press releases as well. The 9th wave, my graduate students today should send me the initial analysis so that we can publish our next wave of results. And I will return to the question, the survey question I showed earlier at the national level with the blue bars, and keep that here, but add the red bars that are the Florida data points, the corresponding data points. And what we see is something I argue is quite different than at the national scale. So in Florida, something else is going on. Namely, the red on the Democrat on the right, we're at 75, 78, or 82% at the state level, 75% at the national level. Well, if you're in politics, and I'm not, but if you're in politics, 50% is the magic number, right? 51%. We're majority rule, and that's the threshold. And if you want to get off this seesaw, you want to get beyond 51%. How far is far enough for you to be comfortable that your voters will stick with you? Well, 78, 75, 82%, the Democrats are in the clear on this issue. The Republicans, as I've said, at the national level, it's different. I don't know how to use this. Yeah, well, there's a tiny red dot. So at the national level, it's 22%, but upwards 49, or rather in Florida, 49% of Florida Republicans believe climate change is real and caused largely by human activity. 49% is not 80%, but it's a lot closer to that magic threshold than you see at the national level. So for the state, we have 65%. That, I would argue, puts us in the zone in Florida of a durable climate consensus. One must not be complacent, but 65%, I think, is enough in Florida. The other question I showed you earlier at the national scale, are you willing to pay a climate tax? Well, the blue bars there recall the national results. In the red are the Republican on the left results for Florida, 47%. Well, is that enough to help the overall statewide approach to being a durable climate consensus? I don't know. And I'm interested to hear if you all have any thoughts about how to quantify at what point we're at a durable climate consensus. But it's getting there, I would say, 47% for Republicans, that's getting there. I've also wanted to dig beneath the surface a little bit, so we have a handful of other questions on the survey. here's one that I think is illustrative of the current cultural debate. And the question is, do you support that our K through 12 schools in Florida should teach about climate change? And there's a lot of cultural war issues and back and forth in our state and nationwide, but in our state. And this is one of them, is what should be in our schools. And so I thought by writing this question that we would see a strong antipathy towards teaching climate change in our schools. But in Florida, just look at the red, and we've divided Republicans there on top, is 35 and older versus under 35 on the bottom, 52% for the older Republicans and 58% for the younger. That, at least for the younger Republicans, seems to me, 58%, to be approaching the zone of a durable climate consensus. Again, with the Democrats in the 90s, there's not much left to discuss with them. No need to spend precious time trying to persuade them. The independents, let's not forget the independents in this state. I think the current split of registered independents and Democrats and Republicans in this state is about 20-40-40. In any case, whatever the real number is, in Florida, independents are not a trivial constituency. They register here, and we've split it again by age with 35 as a cutoff. Below 35, 70%, and 35 and over, 68%. So that, I would argue, is probably for the independents in the durable climate consensus zone. And I, again, think that's illustrative of an issue that has really resonated across party lines when you're starting to talk about what we do with our children in our schools and in our curricula. So let me pivot a little bit to something more abstract momentarily, if you'll permit me. And it gets to the question of decision making. And this harkens back to the climate science intersection that we discussed a few minutes ago. And it suggests that, and it recalls for us that, well, why are we still at this razor-thin margin without a durable climate consensus? Isn't the science clear? And of course the science is clear, but to suggest that because the science is clear, that then we would observe behaviors of a certain rational or logical nature, namely doing something pretty bold in a consistent and durable way to arrest climate change, really is premised on this Enlightenment view of human decision making that assumes, and this is very familiar to those of us in the academy, that we are conscious and unemotional in our decision making. We're very logical, abstract, universal in calculating, and it's just the facts. And we take a cost-benefit approach, and of course, this is nonsense. It's largely false. Those of us in the academy, we are professionally trained to take that mentality on, but when you reach for the soda at the convenience store, you're probably reaching for the one that has the brightest color. We don't always I believe this firmly, take this kind of calculating approach to decision making, and this is relevant here for the area of how people respond to the climate challenge in their opinions and what actions they support. Well, you might ask, well, if our decision making is not really described well by this rational view, then what is it well described by? Well, it's kind of just the opposite. Our reasoning is mostly unconscious. It's grounded in emotion. It uses a logic, but the logic is one of frames and metaphors and narratives. And we know this from advertising and attempts to persuade. A certain kind of messaging works with certain folks that doesn't maybe work with other folks. So let me introduce to you one of the kind of theoretical frames that we're using to try and unpack how we see this segmented set of public opinions on climate change. And it's referencing an anthropological theory called cultural theory. where there are certain normative views about how society should be structured. And people have different perspectives on that. And that frame is one of the primary prisms through which people pass pretty much most of the propositions they're faced with, such as, do you believe in climate change and should we do something about it? If so, what? Well, what are these archetypes from this theory? I'll just share with you a couple of them as I close up here. One that we call hierarchists. And so here are some illustrative quotes that you might hear from people who have a hierarchical view of world, of the way society should be structured. I'm for my country, right or wrong. The police should have the right to monitor our phone conversations. I'm stricter about right and wrong than most people. Individualists are better characterized by a more individualist perspective, so economic growth is something that improves quality of life. The welfare state, which is anti-individualist, damages initiative, which is not good. Egalitarians are somewhere on the, they would resonate with comments such as conflict is based on the unequal distribution of resources, and therefore equalizing the distribution of resources would resolve conflict. Misusing scientific knowledge is a serious problem, and so forth. There are also maybe a few other groups, one of which might be the fatalists, who are just kind of throw their hands up and it doesn't matter what I think or do, things are out of my control. So the point here, again, is that the science is the science, and when we talk about a scientific issue like climate change, it is also entirely legitimate and should be expected that people will pass the scientific information through a prism that has one or more of these types of, I'll use the word biases, but not in a negative way. It's just we are, as a species, I think, adapted to responding to our environment, which includes our conversations, instinctively based on what we feel is good and right. So I will conclude here again with the motivating question: what would a durable climate consensus sound like, and how can we get there? I'm interested in your feedback. I'm on the path of saying, number one, stop condescending. We may not know when we're condescending. What we need for a durable climate consensus is not everyone in the Democratic Party and everyone in the Republican Party and everyone in the independents, but instead enough to get us over that 50% magical threshold. And I believe there is a good swath of the Republican electorate and independents for whom they pass the scientific discussions and the tone in which they are offered through a prism that generates opposition based on their cultural worldviews. Less messaging and more dialogue. And so there the proposition is to listen and engage with the swath of the electorate that is there and interested, provided we don't condescend. And then drawing from the previous slide, if we recognize that people legitimately and without fail, I would argue, use their personal cultural worldviews to interpret pretty much everything they come in contact with on a daily basis, including scientific arguments, then we would benefit from adopting their frames and to speak with them from those frames, and to recognize we also have our own frames. With that, I will end. Thank you.